they had Sabbath restrictions on there, and one of them was pulling an ox from the ditch. And then in Matthew, Jesus is complaining, but I didn't think there was anything, and I never came across anything out of Judaism that would disallow that, right? I mean, even healings, like to do good on the Sabbath is a positive thing, right?
Yeah, it's technical. It's not like it's like the antithesis of the concept of the spirit of the law. There's no spirit of Shabbat. There's like
Right.
laws. There's technicalities. So like specifically, if it'd be pulling an ox out of a ditch, there's no problem with that. That's not.
Yeah.
As far as like Talmudic law goes, that's not. There's no violation of anything.
See, I thought maybe the writer Matthew was writing against that community who thought that, because
the Qumran community did a lot of weird stuff on Shabbat. Like they're ascetics, right? So they have these weird restrictions that like normative Judaism would say is just like insane. Like for instance, say their latrines. That's a big thing. The latrines were 2,000 cubits outside their camp, but they had a restriction on Shabbat not to go 1,000 cubits outside. That means they weren't going to the washroom over Shabbat. Like it's so. Yeah, I love learning about that stuff because usually anything with that community specifically, when you read about stuff about their laws of Shabbat, it's what most Jews would consider to be it'd be like beyond extreme.
Uh-huh.
But I guess it's built that way on purpose.
Yeah, so I went to Used Bookstore today. I got another book haul. I found somebody must be cleaning out their. Maybe they went Baptist or something, but somebody's cleaning out their bookshelves. I found 3 Bart Ehrman books, hardcover. And then I found Karen Armstrong's book, Jerusalem. And these are all hardcovers. And then I got them for like $1 a piece. I walked out there with like a stack of 6 books for $6, and I just thought it was a steal. Somebody's dropping them off down. I usually check like once a week, and somebody's cleaning out their library or something, but they're awesome books.
I started very recently volunteering at a library gift shop, and they resell donated books to the general public to help fund the library. I think I mentioned this once or twice. And you'd be surprised. In the few times that I've been able to volunteer over the last few weeks after training, there have been people who come into the shop at least twice and donated at least 20 books and magazines. It's a regular thing because people are going through moves or this or that, or they just have to make space, so they donate what they have on their shelves. And I've seen people buy whole reams, whole sets of comics and old Western novels and informational books. So definitely check your used bookstores and all that kind of stuff, because at any given moment there's somebody that comes in and donates something. You'd be surprised what's on the shelf.
Yeah, I also found David and Solomon Israel Finkelstein hardcover. I had his paperback. My camera's showing backwards. And then his Bible on Earth paperback I found in hardcover.
That's a good book.
Yeah, so I had both these books, but I sent them to
yeah, it's a good book.
Jordan Day. I packed them up, soft covers, because in my apartment I didn't have any room, and I sent them to Jordan Day, and I found these for $1 a piece. And I was like, wow, I can get them back because we're in the house now. We got more room. So I'm buying some of those books back that I really wanted to keep.
Steal.
Yeah. I almost felt bad. I almost donated $2 for books,
Those are good books too.
Yeah, the only thing I've read on Ecclesiastes was out of the Anchor Bible commentaries.
Yeah.
They're kind of older.
I want a standalone copy, but I don't know if they print those. Because I don't want to buy a Catholic Bible. So it's one of the. It was one of the. It's quoted a lot, so it's important to Jews, but I can't get it in English because Jews don't print it in English, only print it in Hebrew. So I have to find a Christian one, but they're all in Bibles. You can't find a standalone copy. But some books you can find, like you can find just Psalms, you can find like just Isaiah. You can find those books, but this one's hard.
Huh. Well, wouldn't the Tanakh have like the Art Scroll have Ecclesiastes in it?
No, Ecclesiasticus.
Oh, I understand.
Ecclesiastes.
Oh, okay, got it.
Ben Sira. Different book, yeah.
Ecclesiasticus is a fun book to study. I actually studied it a little bit because I was doing some research on sort of responses to alcohol consumption, because I was doing something with the prohibition. And Ecclesiasticus actually is a very positive view of drinking rightly, and in moderation, and it says something like wine is as good as life to a man. Very, very positive passages in Ecclesiasticus to wine consumption.
So it's interesting because Ben Sira's quoted a lot in Jewish circles, like in old texts and stuff. I think it's quoted maybe twice in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud. But when you read the accounts of when they were canonizing the Tanakh at Yavne, the books that they really argued that shouldn't, when they were making the final canon, was about Esther, and not Esther. Sorry, it was about Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, whatever. So they were arguing whether those books should be. Yeah, but Ezekiel was first. It was like much. That was way. I'm talking about right at the end before they sealed it. And Ecclesiastes was the last book that they finally decided should go in because they thought people would just read it wrong. And but what's interesting is in one of the accounts of that conversation, somebody takes a line they quote exactly from Ecclesiasticus as like a defense for I think Song of Songs. So it even plays a role in the creation of the canon. But at the time, even though they were quoting it, they didn't try to put it in canon, which is interesting. But they still held it as like a book of our tradition. So I find it interesting that other faith traditions actually canonize it to a degree, I guess. So.
Yeah, I'm not someone to know here. I'm just trying to look up your book here because I knew I'd seen something a while back.
Welcome, sir.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Doing all right. How are you guys?
Not too bad. They're discussing the particulars of canonized books within the Old Testament Christianity and among the Torah and the Tanakh in Judaism, and the sort of differences therein, particularly in Ecclesiastes and Ecclesiasticus, and the differences.
Aha.
Been busy with work?
Yeah, we're getting into the season of graduations, so all the high schoolers are leaving and looking for schools because they delayed and didn't think ahead.
Big surprise. And that's why they have you. Yeah.
This is true. Convince them, hey, come to my school. I'll give you money. Financial aid, Bank of America.
You're referring kids to Bank of America?
No, I said I'm the Financial Aid Bank of America.
Oh, great.
Because everyone believes that, oh, I need money, I'm just going to go to financial aid. They'll give it to me because I'm a bank.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what you do. I'm actually in the works right now of putting in another application. They're actually looking at it, and they might bring me in for an interview, which I'm looking forward to, for an admissions counselor position. So we'll see how that goes. It's probably the worst position you can get in the college in terms of travel and everything else, but it's my foot in the door. So.
Well, the nice thing about it, and I say this even because within my position, I'm kind of like the bridge of financial aid and admissions.
Yeah.
For my college specifically, we have access to a state car. We have access to, campus credit cards. So you don't really use your own money for traveling.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Even if you did, you get reimbursed for it.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of the benefit of it. The time away sucks, but it's kind of cool because then you're just kind of like, I'm just going to go back to my room every night and I'm going to watch Netflix.
Yeah. Should be good. Sorry, let's continue the smart people conversation.
Yes, absolutely.
Man, this is pretty hard path. I'm not finding anything. I would go with a Catholic edition, but I don't know if... Yeah, right here. They have it in the new Revised Standard Version, Catholic edition. So probably any of your Catholic edition Bibles will have it in it, but the new RSV has it. I love that translation. It's, like it's more modern, straightforward kind of stuff, but...
So to start sort of a new conversation here. I am actually going to start volunteering. I actually already have started volunteering at the Ephrata Cloister. The Ephrata Cloister is in Ephrata, Pennsylvania, which is actually where I'm living right now. And the cloister is run by the Pennsylvania History Museum Commission as an example of the wide amount of religious liberty that was granted to people in Pennsylvania, where other colonies would throw you out of government or anything. Like if you're Catholic, for example, Pennsylvania was a place where anyone who believed in a monotheistic, any person who held a monotheistic belief system could live here peacefully and not be bothered. And even if you were sort of on the fringes in terms of your monotheism, which is really what the cloister was, they weren't bothered. It's really, really interesting. I think that I've been trying to sort of answer the question, okay, what draws people to this historic site? And it's almost like the ascetic practices, I think. They only ate one meal a day at its height. Now, this is the zenith, so we're talking like the 1740s, 1750s, 1760s. Is the sort of zenith of this community here. And
Hey,
they had,
Jonathan,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt. I just want to be sure that it's the same one because I believe I may have visited that. Are the doorways like really short so you have to bend over to go inside?
Yeah.
Okay, I've been there. My buddy Richard took me down there for a field trip one day, so I got to go through the whole site. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing because 75% of the stuff there is original. A lot of your historic sites today are, well, this is what we believe it used to look like, and it's a manufactured. There's this real fine line between selling history and actual history. This one actually has a great deal of actual history there, which is pretty neat. But I think, I mean, their lifestyle, their spiritual lifestyle was very austere. I mean, they had one meal a day at 6 o'clock. Um, they worked from like very early in the morning, in the afternoon, cut by periods of prayer. They took 3 hours of sleep, and then had a midnight service from like midnight to 2 in the morning, and then they went back to sleep for another 3 hours, and then it was back to the grind. And it was just like, these people must have been the most sleep depraved, hungry. I'm sure they were seeing visions because of how delirious they were. Uh, the but I mean, one of the journals refers to these people as the thin, pale, gaunt ones. Some guy was writing to a friend in a letter, we're going to see the pale, thin, gaunt ones. And I was just I brought it up because I think it's an interesting point of discussion. It's sort of like, as people who are religiously minded, I think that it's interesting to look at these very strange, austere groups and to see what we sort of like about them, what we think we can learn from, what we think is really, really bad about them. And one of the things I've really been interested in is what a priority they put toward prayer and meditation. And so, just as something I sort of tried, we see, sort of just fast all day until 6 o'clock, eat one meal, and then, it's not exactly a lifestyle. I'm not going to sleep deprive myself. I don't want to, screw with my work schedule. But it's interesting to sort of try out these aesthetic practices.
How would one define an aesthetic practice? I can think of my own definition, but I want to understand how other people would view it.
I suppose you could start out with some sort of anything that you could sort of define as a spiritual discipline of some kind. I would sort of view as an aesthetic practice, and that could be through physical actions or mindful actions, I guess. And one of the things that I guess sort of strikes me a lot is the sort of there's a variety of religious faiths that practice different aesthetic disciplines, and to me, I've always had trouble with asceticism for the most part because I think that it leads to a works-based, I do the things and the God rewards me because I did the things.
Could I interject on that?
Yeah.
So, like, I would argue that, I wouldn't even argue, I think it just is, the kosher laws is a purely aesthetic practice. It is to create a restriction and a boundary and self-control. But I wouldn't say it has anything to do with pleasing God. It's to enable us to be better servants, but it has nothing to do with any kind of... There's no benefit of it other than creating a disciplined person. And that's the reason why they're there, but it has nothing to do necessarily with to win over God.
Yeah,
it's a vehicle to get to God.
Yeah, to win over favor, etc.
But I don't think it is, though.
I'm agreeing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I didn't mean to make sort of a blanket statement, but only a feeling. There's a large quantity of aesthetic practices that seem to be geared in that direction. I think if you want to go back to sort of like a Judeo-Christian tradition, I think there's that there's this one passage of a vow that a man makes, and he ends up like, if you do this, or if this happens, I'll kill my son or something like that. I forget the specific story.
It's in Judges. He comes back from a war, and he says, the first thing that runs out of my house, I'll sacrifice.
I'm going to kill it.
Too bad it wasn't the family dog, huh?
Yeah.
But, the writer does a good job at fixing that, kind of like the girl goes into a kind of like a secluded kind of, where she gives herself up, becomes a virgin, and the women cry, and, so there's interesting stuff going on in there for sure. But I guess that whole thing was put in there to show how you need to be careful with your vows.
Yeah.
Because the gods will hold you to it. Even in Greek, maybe Kevin can attest to this, how they used to do that, especially in the Iliad and the Odyssey, vows, and then when they don't repay, the gods come find them. Even in, you see that happening even in tragedies and things, of the playwrights.
The main concern of the tragedies and of most of the epic poetry and things like that in ancient Greece was humility and staving off against hubris, the spiritual arrogance of a man to either rise too far above or too far below his station and his status as a mortal. And it reflects a polytheistic animistic view wherein there's an interconnectedness of things, and that there's a place for that which is animal, a place which is that which is plant, of man, of God, of spirit, things like that. And that is to say that if you are a man, you cultivate your excellence and you cultivate your place in life through mortal living. And so a lot of the stories are used as allegory to describe mental processes and emotional processes that go on in a person's life and that they wrestle with to maintain a virtuous life and to cultivate their personal excellence, which I've mentioned a few times, quite a few times here in group, that idea of personal excellence, the pursuit of that excellence. So there is definitely a sense, though, of keeping oaths. That was very important. That your word was was you. You would stick to your word, but that's a cultural value that many cultures would have valued. It's a universal cultural value, that is to say, not to be redundant. But I think it is more important to understand your place in the cosmos. That's what mythology largely is there to teach through symbolism.
So I wonder when that started, the whole idea of asceticism. Like, biblical literature doesn't have it, where people consciously say, I'm going to consciously not do this because, like I know Path said the kosher laws, but I mean, if you read say Abraham and Jacob and all those kinds of patriarchs and texts, like, people aren't actually making a conscious decision. Like Abraham picked the pastures and Lot picked the city, that kind of stuff. But it wasn't, to a point where I suffer every day to make me a better servant of the gods,
Yeah, I just don't see the suffering part because, like, at least I would say, my own bias obviously, but in classical Judaism, concept of asceticism and suffering, they don't merge. So think of the archetype of who an ascetic is in the Torah would be a Nazarite. Like, they're not really afflicting themselves or causing themselves any harsh, maybe inconveniences at best, but they're not they're not flailing themselves or wearing wool all the time. It doesn't seem like, at least from a Jewish perspective, asceticism doesn't seem to be something that's supposed to actually, I don't know, hurt you or actually cause you some kind of discomfort. It's more just a mindset change, it seems. Being more mindful of stuff like this. I don't know.
I guess maybe it's to put you in a certain class, to identify you with a certain holy class. Because I guess the priestly class and then the...
I do have to say there are some Eastern European Hasidic Jews that do perform stuff like that. They'll jump into snow without any clothes on, and they'll do kind of whippings kind of. So there are a small sect of Hasidic Jews in Eastern Europe, from Eastern Europe, that do that. But apart from that, that's yeah.
May I put in my 2 cents?
Sure.
Okay.
So, when you look at ascetic practices in the context of religious tradition, they are extensions of mysticism. And mysticism, when you really get down to the brass tacks, is ultimately an extension of devotion. Devotion to a particular deity, devotion to a particular tradition or sect. So typically they're a part of what we would call, when we're talking in Greek tradition, mystery traditions. They could also be a part of philosophical traditions, which are ultimately interrelated when we're speaking of Greek and Roman religion. But if you trace that back far enough, it eventually goes into much earlier practices in human history and traces much further back into tribal societies, where there were these sorts of castes of society, the priest, the shaman, who would engage in these practices to gain deeper wisdoms and understandings of the world that they were trying to make sense of. So, and that would involve all sorts of different things, but generally the most classically understood kind of shamanic practice is one of pain, one of engaging something that is difficult, even something that is outright dangerous, like the consumption of massive amounts of hallucinogens to have a Gnostic experience. But it can be as simple as deprivation of the senses. Some of the most fundamental sort of practices that we see in mystery traditions is the concept of katabasis, which is this idea of the descent into the underworld. And when you start looking at shamanic practices, this is echoed very, very far back, because there was this view to gain wisdom, you would have to enter into the underworld. And katabasis refers to descent and return. So you descend into this underworld, into this unconscious realm, to gain these often abstract or not easily discernible insights about things, about the nature of things, and coming back to those is the process of contextualizing those experiences with a conscious alpha state mind. Does that make sense? So a lot of these Ascetic practices refer to these very, very early, very ancient practices within societies.
Yeah, I think like the Nazarite Code in number 6, might belong to, early tribal league warriors. That's where it would start. Like Samson was, and also you see what you were saying, Kevin, in 7 Rights of the Lakota Sioux in the Native Americans, with not only Sundance but spirit calling ceremonies. Where they would put themselves in a trance-like state, or maybe vision quests, or you cut a pound of flesh at the Sundance pole, that kind of stuff. All these.
There are
you come back as a hero.
There are markers of these experiences. There are things that are typically incorporated. A lot of times they incorporate dance and music, sometimes the consumption of substances, usually the deprivation of the senses, or the overload of the senses, which is also a common thing. There are passive and active forms of Gnostic experience, and different classifications contingent upon traditional understandings, upon mythologies, and on the state of the society. The more communal the society you look at, the more common it is to engage in these practices, because they're less rigidly doctrinal, and they're much more abstract, much more symbolic in representation. And each member of that society has an active role, and usually one that is relegated to specifics. So they would have their warriors, they would have their shaman, they would have their people who would make things, they would have people who would take care of children, things like this. So if you take that basic model and apply it to different traditions, you start to see the patterns and the ways in which they develop, and the reasons for the exceptions to that rule. And really, when you're looking at traditions that become more doctrinal and more structured, there's a propensity, an increasing propensity, the further you get to the present, to relegate those more mystical and more abstract experiences as being dangerous and to be avoided. And that's a part of the reason why when you look at things like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the tragedies, there's constantly the sense among the Greeks to avoid these things. The Greeks prided themselves in rationality, and they believed that rationality should be an extension of and extended to religious practice, that they should ultimately reflect one another. But that didn't mean that they weren't there, and they were definitely practiced, particularly in folk practice among the general populace. So generally, when you're looking at mysticism, that tends to be the case, is people engage in these in very private ways. But even with people who have relegated themselves to the status of a mystic or an ascetic, that's also very personal. These are usually people who take themselves out of society so that they can engage in these more Gnostic experiences. But they are almost always, in whatever society you look at, viewed with a certain sense of distrust, or at least viewed with suspicion. And that is echoed in the Bible.
and a little bit of fear. Like even if the person was your enemy, you still feared him a little bit because you knew he was a shaman, or you knew he was, out of respect for his part in that.
And some of that was intentional in the part of in the part of the mystic themselves. Sometimes if they were able to cultivate a certain sense of distrust, they were able to put a distance between themselves and the rest of the general population, so they could focus on whatever mystical practices they were trying to cultivate, or in the development of new ideas and the development of new sects. Because when you really look at it, a lot of the newer religions that came into the scene at whatever period of time we're looking at, they largely came out of these heterodoxic mystical traditions at some point. I mean, look at Christianity. Look how it started in comparison to a lot of Jewish religion that had existed at the time, and that is echoed in Greek religion with, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, a lot of these fringe philosophical and mystery tradition type things, the cult of Mithras, the cult of Isis. I'm sure you're seeing this sort of pattern. And that was a much larger, broader kind of pattern of heterodoxy, because at the time people were looking for different answers to things. They were looking for these hidden understandings. The culture had evolved to such an extent where they felt that there was a necessity for the esoteric.
Yeah, I found that, especially when doing a little bit of studying in Native American religion and mysticism, like you're saying, I found that those groups, or those shaman who were part of that, when they come out of that and maybe convert to Christianity, they kind of spill the beans on their own society through the view of Christianity. I pick those books up and read them because normally they wouldn't talk about it. It'd be hidden, But after the conversion or the assimilation process, they come right out and talk about it. And one of those books was The Bushman and the Spirits. If you can grab a hold of that, that's full of information if you can get around the Christian stuff. It's really good book.
There's also something to be said for some of these mystical cultural practices dovetailing with their sense of rites of passage within society. And you definitely see this in studies of Mesoamerican and Northern American native traditions, but you also see this in Aboriginal societies throughout the world. There was a sense that you went through different stages of life, that there were rites of passages for birth, there were rites of passages if it existed for things like circumcision, there were rites of passage for puberty, there was rites of passage when you made your ascent into manhood to be a warrior. And oftentimes there were very elaborate rituals for a person to get to that point. And oftentimes monikers or titles that were given to people once they reached a certain age, parts that were incorporated into the general language in the way that people describe. Youths over here, adults over here. And you see this in different ways and in different manifestations. And I think a lot of that has been lost in the post-axial age societies that we are a part of. We don't see a lot of the context of these things because a lot of our rites of passage have been streamlined out, if that makes sense. They've been pushed away and oftentimes have been relegated to very specific generational folk practices among families and not the whole society. We are less and less communal and more metropolitan by definition.
Yeah, so now it's more or less graduation. You're 21, you're old enough to drink, your driver's license, your entrance into college, your graduation from college, and your first job. Those are all pretty much, the standard rites of passage now that we see as markers, for the most part.
However,
I mean, in secular society,
However, there is something also to be said for the retroactive element of these sorts of practices. In other words, they eventually come around full circle. How often have you interacted with people in their early 20s who come to the age to drink, and there is effectively, in some manner, at least topically, a sort of ritual of having your first night out to drink, things like this. I'm sure you've probably had kids or met kids who, when they turned 18 or their buddies turned 18, they had a cigar because they could smoke now. So there are, to some extent, at least sort of more subculturally speaking, and less in the broader cultural sense, there are sorts of traditions that have developed in different ways among different modern cultures that reflect rites of passage. And this is basically anthropology. This is modern anthropology. What we're talking about right now is basically what is discussed on a regular basis in anthropological and sociological studies. So this is the book you were talking about earlier, what you posted, The Bushman and the Spirits. Okay, interesting. Is it cross-cultural in focus, or does it focus mainly on, Native American, or usually a lot of these books tend to focus on a specific Aboriginal culture?
I'm not sure. I know he was a shaman. I read it so long ago, but I just remember, bits and pieces about what it was, and remembering that it was an awesome book. So I'm not exactly sure what tribe he would be from.
Well, a lot of times, if you're saying Bushman, you're usually referring to Aboriginal cultures in the African continent.
No, this is a Canadian.
Common. Interesting.
Yep, it's Canadian.
Well, there's definitely a lot of native tribes in what is now modern Canada, or at least ones that still exist. If I remember right, Blackfoot Indians are pretty common in Canada. Is it the Cree, Reuben? I was unsure if Blackfoot were northern North America or if they were full on into, well, I mean, Canada is technically North America, so surely there's probably some overlap. Yeah, Blackfooted or a smaller tribe. That much I did know. I actually did remember, the reason why I say so is I remember some people in my dad's side of the family who had mentioned that they had found through genealogy records that my father's side of the family is connected to Blackfoot Indians, 4 or 5 generations back. There was a relative, an uncle, something like that. And my great-grandfather was French Canadian, so was his wife. So. As I'm sure you're aware, this is kind of my bread and butter. Pre-Christian indigenous cultures, whether they're classical polytheistic cultures of antiquity or much older cultures or cultures living in a much earlier state in what we would consider modern sociological development. And it's interesting to see the parallels between the two. Things that have continued and a lot of things that have been pushed to the wayside. Sometimes even buried in the sort of collective consciousness of people, to such an extent that they're almost openly mocked. And I'm not speaking necessarily to secularism and its interpolation between spiritual ideas, folkloric ideas, but more like urban legends, and how that sort of developed out of a more modernized society, and way it's viewed by different people in different instances and different contexts is kind of fascinating. I think there's a really common tendency when people talk about folklore to try to make more correlations than distinctions. An example I could give using Native American as an example. Skinwalkers. It's a different mythological tradition than the werewolf, if that makes sense. And they're different. And I'm sure if you've been involved at all in popular culture and discussions about Twilight, I'm sure you've heard somebody mention this at least once or twice. But there is a good historical reason to look at those differences and their purposes within society. The werewolf has much more of a negative perspective. They're viewed as a cursed individual who becomes a beast outside of their own intention. Unbeknownst to them in some instances, not even realizing that they're a werewolf. Whereas oftentimes a skinwalker, depending on which tribe you're talking about, it's an elective transformation. They actually choose to change into the skin of something else. So these differences reflect how cultures viewed their relationship to nature, their relationship to other people and other tribes, and oftentimes they're used as, like I said, allegories to describe those inner natures of people and the natures of communities as a whole. Though sometimes folklore has to do with just fear. Like oftentimes the view of vampires was in place because there were things that happened to a dead body that scared people, and they didn't understand why. So there was this view that what was happening to the dead body as it decayed was a tendency to perhaps rise from the grave and to become this vampire creature. And the reason why a lot of times there's this view that vampires can only enter a home if they're invited reflects an idea that you keep the dead away from the living. Does that make sense? So there are definitely good, solid anthropological reasons for it outside of mysticism and religious belief for why certain folklores develop.
I think Campbell did that a lot. Highlighted the similarities rather than differences. You know, and he was pretty popular, so I think he had a lot of influence in doing that for more modern times in thinking about it. And actually, one of the people that I talked to complained about that. She's this older lady, and she's pretty well read, and I'm friends with her son. I went to college. When I go visit him, he loans me books. And she says, "Oh, I don't like Campbell." I said, "Why not?" She says, "Oh, he always talks about the similarities, but he never talks about how they're different."
And I think it does bear mentioning that not even just within academia there is a hostility directed towards Campbell, and also loosely to this ostensibly Jungian concept of divine concepts and mythologies and folklores. But it's not just within academia, it's also among pagans. There are quite a few neo-pagans, and particularly of the eclectic variety, of the more modern contemporary variety, who take a lot of stock in what Campbell wrote and what Carl Jung wrote. But there are many people like myself who are more a part of the Reconstructionist aspect of the larger neo-pagan community, who view it with a great hostility. Because a lot of what he does sort of takes the integral and fundamental and different, diverse natures of these different traditions and their cultural aspects and the time periods in which they developed out of context. Entirely out of context in some cases, largely through a sort of modern Western perspective. And it would be one thing if he was trying to make these correlations as a thesis that was honest and genuine, that he put his biases out there when he wrote but a lot of what he was trying to say, he was almost wording it in a sense that, well, this is fact. This is the way to view mythology, is this way that this archetypalism that both Jung and Campbell seem to be so popular in sort of portraying. But I also think it's worth mentioning, too, that he was often responding to people who were looking at these older mythologies as like science projects, like these ancient peoples were like animals, and that what they believed was silly superstition that had no real spiritual content, sometimes within a ostensibly secular view, and sometimes with a Christian view, viewing these primitive peoples, if that makes sense. Welcome, Ocean.
Yeah, that's why I kind of liked him, because he did that for that reason, and it got to, for me anyways, it showed me the function of myth and folklore within a culture and how important it is. You know, I think he underlined that. Another guy who used a broad brush that I used to like for the reason I just said, you know, because it showed the importance, was what influenced Campbell too, was The Golden Bough by Fraser.
Yeah.
And you know, he just, you know, took a brush across everything, and now his, you know, research is questionable. You know, here's this huge anthropological study of all these different aspects of different societies, and comparing and contrasting, well, not contrasting enough, and just, you know.
There are a few things that always come to mind, and I'll use this as an example. Say that I interact with a college kid who's looking at a mythology. What would be the first thing that I would tell them? I would tell them read the classics first. You read Walter Burkett, you know, Greek religion. Read things like The Golden Bough. Read Power of Myth. Read these older writings, and then continue. Some people stop there and they never look further. They don't look into other views. So I think it's important not only the histories of the subject matter, but the histories of its analysis as a whole are important. And you need to start somewhere, so you start with the oldest and you move forward. Now, on the broader spectrum, what we're really looking at when we're making these analogous comparisons is criticism. When you're applying different modes of thought and different disciplines of thought to other things. So applying feminist theory to comic books would be an example of a criticism. To really truly have an examinative, to have an authoritative, to have a thorough examination of any one particular subject, you need to have a broader view. So you can't just look at Jung, you just can't look at Campbell. You have to look at all of these different sources and be open to exploring different kinds of criticism, whether it's through anthropology, through sociology, through studies of mysticism, or even just economics. I mean, I've seen economic theory applied to religious belief, and at least political theory applied to religious belief and its formation. I'm sure you've heard ideas like that in the formation of Christianity and its relationship to the Roman Empire. There are many different ways to look at things, and you can't consider yourself having any kind of firm grounding in the material unless you are able to look at all of it. And that takes work. A lot of people are not willing to put in the work. They're not willing to put in the time. But I think they really don't have much excuse, because so many things are available, oftentimes free. When people just conclude based on the first thing they've read, I just think to myself, well, that's your pacifier. You know, that's not a way to go about material. That's where the frustration, at least from my side of the fence, comes from.
Well, I got to take off, group. Nice talking to you, Kevin. See if I can
Always
make it
good to
back
have
here.
you.
Take care, Ruben.